Really, what I learned in the last session is that I really will be citing Celeste and um, Catherine's work in the future. Um, so, surprise, surprise, my work's on the impression change model. You know what that's about. All right. So, I want to talk a little bit, though, about how there's been a long engagement between affect control theory and gender. And I want to talk a little bit about how affect control theory has thought about gender. And the reason why I want to do that is, while we know that gender matters, how gender matters is something that we are still grappling with, right? So in ACT, I just came up with these titles. People can reject them, but I call this the socialization model. The socialization model says that men and women have different impression change equations, at least slightly, because they've gone through a separate socialization process. And where that comes out formally is that we estimate separate equations for men and women. The mediation model says, hey, gender dynamics work through EP and A. If you take gender dynamics and you had EP and A variables out of context ratings, the out of context ratings by and large would mediate the gender effects. That EP and A explains gender. And why that is because EP and A profiles have consistent patterning across gender. And then there's the traits model, or the modifier equations. So affect control theory right now can allow us to model individual differences in terms of prototypicality by simply using an adjectival modifier. So for instance, if I say masculine nurse, that will bump nurse's EPA profile within my equations up or down. So what I'm proposing, based on Cecilia and Lynn's work, is that we consider identity prototypicality. I think this is going to be very familiar to the people at the back of the room, and I definitely will be talking to you soon. And so how do I do that? Well, okay, so we know this. We know that. Sorry. So what I did is I think identity prototypicality is likely to be a cultural sentiment that's shared. So I ran a study where I collected I asked participants to rate the 102 identities that are in the impression change data sets. I will do them all eventually, but I was isolating it on the impression change data sets. And they saw a prompt like an underdog is, and then they could select male, female, or either both. The either both was after Lynn almost was like, I was nearly going to have a fit when you made me do male or female babies. That's just wrong. And actually, she really, you're going to see just how wrong that was in a minute. So thank God for Lynn jumping in there, because I was going to force these poor people to do male or female for either one. Strong, hard binary. Bad, very bad. Anyway, so I had on average 35 participants roughly for every single concept that I did. So I have some confidence that my identity prototypicality measures are okay. I did an MTurk study, so my age distributions are around early middle life, and my proportion female is 42%. I'm really leaning hard on the cultural meanings assumption that we share these meanings. All right, so what identities went where? Well, so I have how did these get placed? So how they got placed is because I'm using NC78, and my contention is that NC78 probably has even stronger gender encoding. So I had to be really confident, because I think in my data there's a likelihood of people doing either both as the right thing to do, as opposed to really their idea about it. So you had to have 70% to be an identity that was including these categories. We have female identities. Some of them are definitional, like niece and schoolgirl, not surprising. Some people did rate schoolgirl as masculine. I was sad about that. But at any event, the male ones are not too surprising. We have roughnecks and monsters and sheriffs. And then in either both. So the thing about either both is we're going to see in these distributions is it's a real category. It's not a category where people are kind of like well, it could have been masculine or feminine. No, people agree, really believe it's either both. And then I have this distributed category, which you're going to see is often male. So this is the x-axis is the number of people, the number of ratings in that concept. The y-axis is the concept. The shading is the proportion. And so red, so female identities are red. Female identities, if you didn't rate it, for those that got grouped in the female identities, if you didn't rate it as female, you rate it most of the time as either both. That's not too shocking. And I got a few masculines. For the male category, overall, like if you didn't rate it as a man, then you rate it as either both. That's also not too surprising. For either both, this part was kind of interesting. They really use a lot of agreement that it's either both. And if it's not either both, then it could be male or female. And then in this distributed hogblog category, it's really almost a tie between masculine, either both, and most of this stuff, right? So there isn't as many distributed where it's either both and female. It's either either both or masculine. And as my colleague Brent a couple months ago was like, you better account for the default male assumption, man. So he pushed me to collect this data. So first, so how do the categories move in EPA space? This is sort of more a confirmatory thing, but we have EPA value in x-axis. The dot is the mean, the bar is the confidence interval, and as we would expect, we have masculine identities more on this negative side, feminine identities a little bit more positive. Either both, you're going to see a pattern where either both and female kind of move together, and then the distributed and male move together. In potency, we see a clear pattern, well, in that male identities are rated, the mean is higher, and activity, not as clear a pattern. So predicting transient impressions, I'm using these actor and gender encoded categories, and then I'm using out of context ratings to predict them. There's my impression change equations, enough said. That's how they work. I really didn't know I was going to be so set up so well before I did this. And this is the distribute. So we're going to look at actor evaluation, actor potency, actor evaluation, actor potency, object evaluation, object potency. A, because we saw distinct patterns, and B, because I think that gender really operates on those two sides of the equation. But I'm interested in behaviors. So this is a distribution of transient AE across all in the NC78 data set across all concepts. And then here, what I'm doing here is I'm using the categories to predict the residuals. So I ran the standard, well, it's not the standard, but the BMS version of the equation, produced the residuals, then used the categories to predict the residuals. And what this plot suggests is that the gender categories do successfully predict the residuals, or how well the impression change models are working. Ugly table. Please focus in on the sides here, but basically model one is the actor object model. We see support that by themselves, the actors and objects do predict transient actor evaluation. We see that actor gender either both positively predicts male, not so much, and then the object gender acting upon a female prototypical identity results in a negative or lowers your evaluation. Model 2 is the ABO equation, and then model 3 is the combined equation. Interestingly, I think that, so we see that this male effect comes in this equation. When that sign flips and when it becomes positive is when you control for the actor evaluation. That's when that gender category really becomes a big deal. We see that the overall model fit of the combined model is a better model fit. And we see that acting upon, I think the key thing that's going to come out of these equations, the themes I want to do is that The object identity prototypicality is very important for predicting evaluation, whereas the actor identity prototypicality is very important for predicting potency. Yes?
What's the omitted category?
The omitted category is that distributed category where there's not a consensus about your gender prototypicality.
Oh, that's why there are zeros up there.
Yeah. So I should have mentioned reference category, correct. Yeah, I'm going to visualize this because this is painful. All right, so the x-axis is all values of actor evaluation. So I'm basically visualizing the stability effect. The y-axis is the predicted values for transient actor evaluation where AE varies, but all other coefficients are held constant at the mean. And the shading is the confidence interval around the AE effect itself. The lines are the effect of actor evaluation by our groups. The thing I really want to zoom in on is that the shading, so the model predicts by itself, AE, I should say, not the model, AE predicts very well what happens to people in the either both female and distributed category, and does not predict as well what happens to men. So that's, and how we're interpreting that is that this blue line is so much farther outside the confidence interval of the AE effect. So if we're turning now to what is the impact of object evaluation on, so the object main effect is object evaluation. The shading of the lines again is our identity prototypicality groups. And what we see is the fact that either both and female are so centrally located in that band, it says that the OE effect is being predicted by what happens to those groups that most, and that the lines outside of that confidence interval, that means the OE effect is not explaining as well what happens to people in these two groups, the masculine and the distributed category. This is not actor potency. This is a distribution of actor potency transient impressions. Again, I'm doing the same thing where I'm predicting the residuals of the ABO equation using these gender categories. And the thing that I like to zoom in on here is just how far off the masculine identity category is from everything else. But also in general that these confidence intervals are fairly tight and fairly are not overlapping. So this is giving us confidence that these categories really are meaningful. And we're seeing some but less support for the role of object person in actor potency equations. Okay, another table. Actor gender female. So is positive, but we have interaction effects. So I really want to zoom in on the interaction effects. So if we interact actor gender with AP, what we see is that for people in the either both category and in the female in the either both category, that they are going to be negatively, the interaction is negative. The people in the female category acting upon women is perceived as positive. And if we can visualize that, we can see this is the effect of actor potency, the stability effect for people in these different groups. And essentially, I like thinking of the actor gender prototypicality as kind of a dampening effect on the power of on the main effect. So essentially, for men, weak men, being masculine dampens the effect of actor potency on your perceived potency. But then once you cross this nice threshold of being just slightly potent, then being male amplifies the effect of object potency on your perceived potency. Yes.
Stability.
Yes, this is the actor potency. The walking in, out of context actor potency on the effect of transient potency. And then for women, we see the reverse effect. That essentially, if you are a female gender prototypical identity, that being in that category suppresses the effect of active potency on transient active potency. So essentially they're getting disadvantaged. They're dampening the effect. Okay, zoom in on the bimodal distribution. I think this is actually pretty important and can be explained. So this is the transient impression of object evaluation. This is zoom in on object person, and we see two big groups, and they correspond to those two things. So with objects, we have bad objects, and we have good objects. And again, what we're doing here is we're predicting the residuals using these identity prototypicality measures. If we look at the model, again, the combined model, it has the best model fit, and we again have interactions, and I kind of want to zoom in again on the interactions. So if you're gender and you're OE, then it's slightly positive, not as strong an effect. It's like 0.06 in p-value. But if you are female and your object evaluation in combined with, yes, if you're female, your object evaluation is getting lowered. But the main effect is women are generally viewed as objects as better objects. It's not surprising that the men are viewed as not great objects. And so I'm looking at these interaction effects as corrections on those main effects. But let's visualize that again. So the same. So this is now the effect of object evaluation, the stability effect on the transient impression of object evaluation, and we can see a big difference between the male line and everyone else. And we can see a slight, it's not quite strong enough to be a super big interaction, but basically this shifting between either, both, and distributed. But the main thing I want to zoom in on is the difference between people in the male category and everybody else. So finally, the object potency results. This is a distribution on object potency. We see some evidence that object person has some influence on potency, but less strongly than in the other models, and that's just because the degree of difference. If we look here, this is not the best fit model. So including, I think we're getting something here. I think it's significant in these models that female actors, being acted upon a woman by a woman makes you perceived as less potent. But on the other hand, from a sort of like formal methodological point of view, I would probably go with the ABO equation as the best explanation about predicting transient impressions.
That's too bad, because that one's really simple to think about.
Yeah.
Just not real, I guess.
So discussion and conclusion. So the effect of gender on EPA dimensions is patterned. I think that I have shown that, and that corresponds nicely to what we've seen over time and what we've had indications of. I think the main takeaway for me, at least at this inchoate stage of my research, is that when we're thinking about gender prototypicality, that people that we act upon really matter about how we're going to be perceived, whereas the prototypicality of me as an actor really has effects on the potency, the likelihood of being perceived as potent or impotent in a given situation. What I'd really like to do is basically move this along by putting these equations into an interact framework and seeing what would be the differences between this approach and doing it with ABO, and also basically to sort of pattern this out a little bit more, and also I'd be interested in looking at how gender prototypicality and behaviors, as in the kinds of behaviors that we perceive people of certain genders doing, has an effect. And to conclude, I do think that gender is an important dimension of meaning. The main contribution here is I think that we can start to try to interact that dimension with affective meanings in some meaningful way, and that can give us more insight about how gender works. and thank you very much for bearing with me.